Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books. How's the sound? Better? We're trying our new system for the first time, so there's still things to work out, but hopefully it'll be an improvement online as well. If you have a cell phone, please silence it at this time. The new winter 2023-2024 Upper Ohio Valley Historical Review is available for $6. Yep, we need quiet, please. We also still have copies of Driving the Green Book by our friend. And next week we have our 363 days to St. Patrick's Day celebration with the County Mayo Irish Band. So don't miss that. We'll be testing out music on the new system. Polish people are welcome. They say everyone's Irish on St. Patrick's Day. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's what they say. Mom, Italians are welcome too. Okay. Today we're very pleased to have these guests with us, and they have written a new book, which you see on the screen, called Rust Belt Union Blues: Why the Working Class Voters Are Turning Away from the Democratic Party. So it's a very important book in this election year. Lainey Newman is a JD candidate at Harvard Law School and a native of Pittsburgh. And Theda Skocpol, as I said, Skocpol. I should check. Czechs are Irish too, next Sunday. Is the Victor S. Thomas Professor of Government and Sociology at Harvard University. So please welcome Lainey and Theda.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here in Wheeling, West Virginia. I think I've only been here once before, but my sister lives in southern West Virginia. So I think the state of West Virginia is quite something. And I'm always glad to be in this part of the country to look and see how things are. What we're going to do is work through our PowerPoint because it has some interesting visual things. As well as kind of the outline of our argument. I know some of you have probably read or dipped into the book, and others want to hear the highlights, and then we'll open the floor for discussion because I'm sure there are people here who've also had experiences that would be wonderful for us to hear. Let me just say briefly how this book came about. I am at this point a very senior professor at Harvard. I had a hard enough time as a woman getting my tenured position in the first place, so they're going to have to take me out on a slab. So I grew up in Michigan. So I grew up south of Detroit, where when the auto industry was supreme and the chemical industry there. So that's my experience with a kind of time when unions were very important public voices, even though my dad, who was a high school teacher, was not in a union at that time. I ended up meeting Lainey when she came to Harvard College. She was in one of my classes and then defined a senior thesis that we'll be telling you about because it's the core of this book. And ended up going home during the COVID year when everybody was sent back to live with their parents, and made good use of that time to do interviews that are the core of this this book. And then we worked together for another year after that, adding new lines of analysis to the book so that it could come out just this year. So it's a book many abandoned buildings. So our question can be very well posed by a couple of quotes from interviews that Lainey did. This is from an 80-year-old retired steelworker living in Charleroi. Back in my day, you couldn't find a single union guy who would vote Republican, he said. And another retiree laughed during his interview as he recalled the looming threat of getting your fingers smashed in if you drove a foreign-made truck to the mill from your nearby home, or if you were known to have voted for a Republican. Well, that's obviously really changed, and one of the things we'll see on one of the slides later is the things that were on the bumper stickers in the still unionized steel mills that are there now. And so that's our puzzle, to try to make sense of the extraordinary change. Yeah, here's some of the bumper stickers. They're either Trump bumper stickers, gun bumper stickers, Second Amendment, or sometimes hunting, Christian right. And a lot of foreign cars too. Yeah, can't get your hands smashed in, or there'd be nobody to do the work. So our question is, why has this transformation that played out over about 70 years, about 7 decades, but has really accelerated in the past 10 to 15 years? Why has that played out so that counties, especially the larger ones across western Pennsylvania, would have routinely registered pretty good margins, in the end kind of more modest margins for Democrats, but now only Allegheny County, because of the city of Pittsburgh, and in the last presidential election, Erie by just a little eke, went Democratic. So one answer is that, is that our first answer? That's not, no, our standard wisdom that we build on, of course, is evident. Unions have changed because the steel industry, most of its facilities closed under the blows of economic transformation, international trade, with both major parties standing by and letting a lot of that play out across the Rust Belt. So that, of course, means that unions as organizations have fewer dues-paying members, fewer members that they can call on at election time to volunteer, and less money that they can give for either electioneering or politicking. And I think Lainey's found that that's even more so because the laws changed in the late 20th century to make it impossible for unions to spend on various other activities besides bargaining. Another answer that a lot of people in our university would hold to is that it's all about racism, that suddenly people have become openly expressive of racially biased attitudes, and that the parties have realigned since the Civil Rights Revolution on questions of who believes government should do more to equalize race relations and who doesn't. And while we don't want to deny that the parties have realigned and that feeds into this, we are deliberately studying a region of the United States where people were overwhelmingly white then and now. So we don't think it's got to do simply with racial prejudices or any other kind of ethnic prejudice. In fact, we believe that people held to stereotypes about each other. In Boston, you know, it was Italians versus Irish for a long, long time. And I'm sure in Western Pennsylvania, there were all kinds of stereotypes that each group had about each other, and that would be true of racial groups as well. We don't think that those are more so now than they were 70 years ago. So we don't think that that factor at the level of people's attitudes can possibly explain the political transformation that we're talking about. So let me just hit a couple of highlights and then hand it over to Lainey to hit some more. This point about prejudice was well captured by one of the interviewees. I think this person was in West Virginia, right? It was a supervisor who was reporting discussions with workers, and he said a while back, now this was a while ago, this interview would have been a couple years ago, yeah. I was talking to a guy who had recently asked a miner he had a lot of respect for about the Ku Klux Klan. The miner gave a very right-on talk, one that Rich Trumka would have approved of. We in the United Mine Workers, we don't care about color. We believe in equality and all that. And then when he was done delivering that answer, he said, but if it wasn't for all of that, I'd probably join the KKK. So this is a point this man was making that actually some pretty rigorous research has demonstrated, that people respond to the organizations they belong to. And they have lots of potential ways they can think about all kinds of issues. But if they're a member of a union, they may hear messages that are about equality and hanging together against the business bosses who are trying to take things away. Even at the same time, they might, think, okay, those other organizations are right about some things. So that's the point that we assume here, and we plunge into looking at other reasons why it was once taken for granted to vote Democratic and is now almost the opposite, particularly among steelworkers. Just to give a hint, we don't think it's because the union leaders are giving different endorsements, or that rank and file workers are necessarily listening to endorsements, or that they ever listened simply to endorsements from on high. So we're looking much more at people's sense of who they are as a union man. They were mostly men back in the time that we're originally talking about, and what kind of community underpinnings the union had, as well as underpinnings in the mills and the workplaces. These are the counties that we're looking at, but as I said, we think that a lot of this applies to, for example, Northeast Pennsylvania, where I've done a lot of field work in Luzerne County, and across the kind of upper Midwest and into West Virginia. So I'll hand it over to Lainey now.
Yeah, so when we started the research, we wanted to get a sense of what the union man identity really was premised on. And so in order to do that, I conducted a lot of interviews for my senior thesis, and then in the year after I graduated college and continued to work with Professor Skocpol, did more interviews and was also looking at some archival documents, some union records, newsletters, convention proceedings from various universities like IUP, Pitt, Wayne State. And through that, we tried to pin down what this union man identity was based on, in what contexts people were referring to the term union man or union family, what types of things were being talked about in those comments. So, when someone would say, he's a great union man, he should be a delegate to the convention or something like that, what were they saying after that to sort of define what that meant to be a union man? And we came up with 3 things that sort of encompassed this union man identity. And the first was mutual commitment. So this idea of being committed to one another and the group, the collective, being willing to put the collective over oneself in certain circumstances. Historical awareness, so being connected to the past and to what the labor movement had achieved, having awareness of the progress that had been made and a previous generation's sacrifice. And then occupational pride was the third, and that primarily concerned, a sense of dignity and pride to one's work, to one's craft, in the building trades, to the extensive training that people go through to get, accredited in those trades. And then in the industrial unions, being really connected to, steel work, auto work, whatever sort of skill one was doing in their daily life. So the combination of those 3 things seemed to be what people were referring to when they were, using this union man identity sort of characterization. And this is here, you can kind of see.
This is from West Virginia, so.
Yeah, this is a West Virginia postcard, right? Or so, no?
I'm not sure. It might have been a document. All right.
Yeah. So the next thing that we look at is the union in communities, and I'll let Theda talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and that mutual commitment doesn't just mean during a strike or during bargaining negotiations. We found that people took a lot of pride in just stepping in and helping one another if somebody got sick or had a family crisis, the kinds of things that build commitment in informal ways as well as formal. So a lot of the next step in our research was to try to understand where this sense of pride in being a union man, doing skilled work in the trades or tough work in the steel mills, where did that come from? And how was it sustained? And we don't think it's just we think it had much more of a rooting, especially in the steel workers' case, in the fact that people usually lived in neighborhoods very close to the mills where they worked. Even if they moved around in their work, and they certainly did, sometimes they moved around locally, but in any event, while they were working, often the family was right there and neighbors were right there. So we see the union as being a presence not just during strikes or during bargaining sessions or formal union meetings, but in a constant round of family activities and recreational activities, some of which were sponsored by and paid for in modest ways by steelworker locals especially, but sometimes were just organized through union networks. Union locals were tied to churches, a rich array of churches, often ethnically defined churches. So you could have many different varieties of Catholic, depending on which group it was. Fraternal groups and ethnic clubs, other unions, and of course the military service organizations showing pride and service during World War I and World War II. We found a pamphlet from the 1960s that the steelworkers put out listing the addresses and giving the pictures of all the union locals across the Rust Belt, so we could put those on a map I'll show you in a bit. And we also looked at the ways in which unions had their own informational outlets. There was no Fox News in that day, but there were a lot of newsletters, and not just national newsletters, sometimes locals had them too. Of course, you all know this reality. Here's Aliquippa with the big plants right near where people were living. Social and recreational activities were just an amazing array of them that we could see in old newspaper articles such as these, these are children's recreation and adults, baseball, bowling, basketball, and shooting, and I'm sure there were others. And it wasn't just local competitions, but sometimes regional and national competitions. Most steel workers and most industrial workers were men in the middle of the 20th century to the late, but ladies' auxiliaries were an important part of the round of activities. And of course, wives and mothers were doing very important work, not just raising children, but also sustaining a whole series of community activities. And I'm sure, putting together the dinners for the Union Hall events or celebrations. So it involved the whole family, is the point. We went through a lot of old newspaper articles, not just in this region, but elsewhere. In York, in the eastern Pennsylvania, there was an ongoing center where laid-off workers could go to get information about the next job and where they could get either public or private aid. Food was distributed in McKeesport. I love this one, that this local spent its entire treasury to give everybody a ham for the holidays. And some of the drives, like this one in Allentown, were for the entire community, sponsored by the union. So that made the union a presence for everyone in the community. These are from my extensive collection of ribbon badges, just to indicate some of the ethnic groups that people might have belonged to. There's one here from, I believe, Croatian Americans, and if somebody can come up and read the letters and tell me whether I've got this right, from Wheeling. Hungarian Americans from Bishop, Pennsylvania, and an African American Oddfellows Lodge from Allegheny. Germans from Jenner, Pennsylvania. Scandinavians from Titusville, where I didn't know until I found this badge in my wanderings, that Swedish workers were brought into the United States to open the first oil industry in northeastern Pennsylvania. And then Slovak Greek Catholics in Johnstown. And the point is that at the beginning of the period we're studying, right after World War II, some workers may have worn union badges that were very similar to the ethnic badges that I've just shown you. And that's an amazing glass workers badge from Toledo, another one from Pittsburgh, and then on the right from right here in Wheeling with the symbols of the trade right on there. These are some of the pictures of the union halls that either single locals would rent or buy, sometimes converting it from a fraternal hall or a bank into a hall that could be used by all the locals in that area. Sometimes locals of smaller unions teamed up. And here's an example. That's the booklet we found, and there's the map of where the halls were around 1960 in a groundbreaking ceremony from Sharon.
Just for USW.
Yeah, that's just USW. That's not counting all the others. So if you count all the others, and of course unions used each other's halls, and fraternal groups met in union halls, and union groups met in fraternal halls. So it was a back and forth, and people met in churches as well. The final point here is that many local unions and the steelworkers had their own newsletters. This is above and beyond the one that the International sent around. And in Bethlehem, they had a radio program. And of course, news of union events would be disseminated, union contract negotiations, but also quite a lot of basic information, like where to go for a hunting license. Hunting is nothing new, as you all know. And how to get access to or understand what was going on in government programs that might be of interest to people. We believe that union participation, whether or not people were grudging about it, taught people a lot of lessons about how to organize meetings, run them, hold offices, elected or appointed offices, what the meaning of union dues was, and of course urged people to vote both in union elections and in state, local, and national elections. This is that 1955 survey that I mentioned before, and I'm not going to dwell on it much except to say that in the amazingly detailed questions that were asked of steelworkers at that time, only a minority believed that it was a good idea for the union leaders to be involved in national politics and to make endorsements. So you'll find newspaper reporters going around and asking workers now, do you believe they should do that, and do you listen to them? And they'll say, no, no, no. And the reporters will say, that's brand new. Well, it's not brand new. Americans in general don't like to be told what to do from above. But what we did see in this survey was that there was enthusiastic support for the union investing in local and community activities and in disseminating information about political candidates and public issues. Democrats at the time were not some distant presence that sent in somebody a month before election. They were there. And this ad from Monongahela, Democrat running for state assembly at the time, lists all of his involvements in all the community groups as well as all of his engagements with the local union. So the point that we draw from all this is that being someone who usually voted Democrat was partly because union men thought Democrats were on their side and with them in the community. So why don't we move on, talk about change.
Yeah, so as everyone knows, a lot changed starting in the late 1960s, but really in the 70s and 80s. There was a significant manufacturing decline, the steel industry collapsed, and politically, there was not, concerted effort or successful efforts of Democrats to save industry or to save certain plants or mills. So there was a decrease in union dues and membership, and many union halls closed, and we've seen closures. Some of my interviewees talked about, the heating bills were too high to fund these big buildings, and so they started, consolidating and end up, renting an office in some sort of office building, that type of thing. What this resulted in in terms of the changing industry was that many, union membership was declining. A lot of women were going to work to support families. There were changing gender and family realities. People were no longer there wasn't a sort of solid, the union way of life of the mom staying home and raising kids was no longer something that many people could attain or afford. And that meant shared home responsibilities and workers driving longer distances. And so what we see as unions sort of stop focusing so much or sort of putting so much effort and resources forth to invest in community outreach and social activities is that other things come up in that space and take those roles. And so what we saw is that recently the places that people are engaging in, community events and social events tend to have more conservative messages and more conservative political messages. And unions don't have sort of the counterweight or the countervailing force that they once did. So some of these organizations, civic organizations, are large conservative churches, including mega churches and gun clubs, which we've actually found have really, social components to them and sponsor things like bingo nights and children's, derbies and competitions and that type of thing. And so the places where people are socializing now and seeking, a sense of community is often, has very different political backdrops than, they once did. You wanna talk Tea Party?
Yeah, meanwhile, the Democrats, I think it's fair to say that in the late 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, Democrats pulled back, simply weren't present in a lot of the places that remained, including with remaining unionized workers, not necessarily have a local Democratic office people could go to, not a lively kind of presence at all, but just relied on sending people in at the last minute or not sending anybody at all. I did research on in 8 different counties around the United States after Trump was elected, and everywhere people told me the same thing. They said, Hillary didn't come here. They sent some young man from Brooklyn at the last minute. When you hear that same phrase in Wisconsin and in Pennsylvania, something's going on. And he told us to do things here that didn't make any sense. So that sense that Democrats are somewhere else in the nation's capital, in the state capital, in university towns, and not here with us is based on reality. The Democratic Party also pulled back and changed its ways of doing things during this period. And we think that's regardless of the particular issues that are stressed. Part of what we're suggesting in this work is that people don't just sit down and go through long tomes of issue positions to decide how to vote. In many ways, they decide how to vote by thinking, who are we? And are they on our side? And being there with them, which was very much the case in the kind of community era, was part of the reason that Democrats made sense. Okay. So let's just get to the bottom line here at this point. And the drift toward Republicans, some of our county chairs told us it was under Reagan. If you look at the statistics for Western Pennsylvania, most of the counties, big counties with an industrial history, did not flip. They drifted toward Republicans, but did not flip in the Reagan era. But Trump comes along in the recent elections, and it's just a tsunami at that point. As you all know, in 2016, only Allegheny County went for Democrats, and in 2020, it was only Erie by a hair and Allegheny. So this is from another one of our interviews. If you needed to go down to the courthouse, they'd ignore you if you weren't a Democrat. That was the way it was. I voted based on a person, not a party. I became Republican during the Obama administration, didn't like the direction it was going. And I'd estimate that 75 to 80% of union people in this county support ours over D's. That might be a little overdone on the part of this very enthusiastic Republican chairperson, but probably not too much. So we did one final step we'll tell you about and then open the floor for discussion.
Yeah, so one of the last things that we did was try to understand the differences between two large unions, one building trade union and one industrial union. So the United Steelworkers and the IBEW. And so we noticed a couple of key dissimilarities between the two. First, that the IBEW has always had more spread out members, geographically. They always covered a larger region, and members were sort of assigned projects rather than a single workplace, under a single, steel mill associated with one particular union, local union. Whereas the United Steelworkers was very geographically rooted, and each individual facility had its own associated local union. Or more than one in some cases. And so the IBEW developed ways to communicate with spread out members. Another key dissimilarity is that the IBEW has mainly still, is mainly still comprised solely of people in the electrical workers field, it's, line workers, et cetera. Whereas the USW has moved to organize many different fields, teachers, nurses, librarians, adjunct faculty members. Same with the other large industrial unions like the United Mine Workers and the United Auto Workers. For example, the Harvard student teachers, which I'm a student teacher, are members of the United Auto Workers. That's our union, so I'm technically a member of the United Auto Workers. You just see sort of the large sort of swath of different types of professions that these larger industrial unions now represent compared to years previous where they'd be focused solely on a single industry or associated industries. So we think that those differences matter. We hypothesize and we have some suggestive evidence that there's more loyalty and sort of more adherence to union messages in the IBEW than in the USW. And there needs to be more research done on this type of thing because many researchers don't disaggregate between different types of unions. But that's sort of what we find suggestively present.
Yeah, and we looked at the newsletters of the electrical workers and international of the steel workers decade by decade from the 60s to the early 21st century. And in this effort to keep in touch with workers who didn't all live in the same place and be part of the same community, the electrical workers actually encouraged people to send in stories about their personal triumphs, their family milestones, their local union activities. Whereas the steel workers didn't do that. We think that's not because they didn't care, but because they could count on that happening another way. Much more
Locally,
locally. But that means that once you get to the current period, there's a little bit of evidence that electrical workers are less likely to have moved completely for the Republic and are certainly more likely to hearing messages from the international leaders because they've been used to hearing messages that mix the personal and the community with the union's business. And they have a little bit more trust. I mean, we got some quotes from a survey where people were saying they were asked what did they think of their union top leaders, and the ones the steel workers sent in are unprintable. They're unprintable. The ones the electrical workers sent in were much more even field, even response. Unfortunately, we can't do better than that because our colleagues in the quantitative side of labor studies just asked in the national survey are you a member of the union or not? And maybe they asked are you a public sector union? But they certainly don't get down to steel workers versus electrical workers, and we think that really matters. So we can stop.
Yeah.
We have anything more? No, that'll come up.
Yeah. So thank you all for listening, and we're happy to take comments and questions now.
Yeah. We're going to sit down and use the microphone. I'm definitely at the sitting down age.
Yeah, well, I have a question for all of you. I'm Sean, 15th Street here. I am a freelance journalist for the Workers Union, an outlet. But what most of the stuff that I end up going out to cover, I'm wondering from all this work that you both did, how does it make you look at the progress that's happening? There's traditional unions that are on a roll.
Yeah, the UAW.
fresh
For sure.
there's major federal investments where unions are organizing south, but also there's non-traditional workers like the Starbucks
Yeah.
workers. Can you talk about what doing all this work has made you think of this new union movement?
Yeah, we can both say a little bit about that. Sure. You wanna-
Yeah, so it's exciting, first of all. I think that, and to see the progress that's been made moving in, the right direction. We were talking a couple weeks ago with someone who did economic policy in the Obama White House, and he was talking about how during that period, the Obama administration didn't even want to use the word union because they didn't know how it would come across. It had more potentially negative impacts, I guess, amongst focus groups or whatever
That's
they
what
were
their
saying.
Consultants told me.
Right. And now, Sean Fain at the State of the Union, and just really exciting things happening. So I think that it's good. There's a lot of legal rules that need to change. That's something that I've been looking at more recently now that I'm in law school. And there's a lot of barriers to organizing and to unionization. So it's promising. I don't think that we're close to obviously what once was, which was about a third of the working population being unionized. But we are seeing that these drives are happening largely in cities, and I think that it would be great to see sort of geographical spread as well, and organization efforts in across industries, not only in service and whatnot, but all is good.
I think it is a good news story. It's also, especially public opinion. Public opinion, it can be measured in a general way in national polls, and it's shifted, particularly among young people. Not necessarily young people who are joining unions, are much more favorable to unions. And as we saw, President Biden signaled something about the Democratic Party by actually going to Michigan and being president. We would love to have done some work on the auto workers to see whether some of the things that we think hadn't happened as the steel workers shriveled in terms of their overall resources have happened. But of course, we know that President Obama actually did step in. Did he save all of the many, many auto plants and auto workers? Of course not. That is not realistic. But he did step in, and it made a big difference for the Democrats in the 2012 election in Ohio and my native Michigan. On the other hand, when I gave the lecture in our Harvard court class about unions, reported all these things, but also said the total number of unionized workers is continuing to decline as a percent of all employees. And most of the new unionizing drives are succeeding in a smaller nonprofit or service industry sites. Now, I don't think numbers are the whole story. And I think this kind of sense that it's spread is something that makes sense to people in a lot of different occupations. But as Lainey pointed out, unions that are building in many different occupations can't count on that occupational pride thing as being automatically there. They would have to introduce. I don't think the teaching fellows at Harvard are being introduced to what auto working is all about and vice versa. But it might not hurt. Why not?
Yeah.
You're right. It's changing, and I do think that some Democrats have gotten the memo. Not all. they've gotten the memo, and in a state like Wisconsin, for example, where Governor Scott Walker really smashed a lot of what was left, including public sector unions, some of those same people are participating in a much more open but locally present version of the Democratic Party, in which they're trying to be everywhere, even in counties where they're not going to win. And so because as I put it the other day, lose less badly is quite wise if you want to carry an entire state or the Electoral College. And Joe Biden, in fact, did better than Hillary Clinton in almost all of the Pennsylvania counties, almost all of the 67 Pennsylvania counties. He didn't do a lot better in some of them, but he did better, and that adds up. That absolutely adds up. Yep.
Wondered if you could talk a little bit about sort of your impressions. I know you weren't talking about service unions, but focusing on industrial unions. But is there some correlation there, do you think, or is there more work that has to be done in order to understand, sort of what's happening in service unions as opposed to industrial unions? First question, and then second question: do you need more research studies for service?
Now, by service unions, are you talking about the SEIU, which is, of course, one blue-collar union that has been growing in this entire period? You're talking about the NEA and the FD. Yeah. Well, I mean, we believe that work on union people and union organizations and unions in politics and community life, how unions react to racial and immigration issues and gender issues, has to be done in a way that can build generalizations. That's what social scientists do. But you better start with the specifics, because the worlds of work, the kinds of people who go into these occupations or who stay in them are quite different. And we think there's been a little bit too much overgeneralization. I'm happy to report that in recent years, I teach mainly undergraduates at Harvard. Now, Harvard, it's an arrogant university. You might, did you notice that? Yeah. But it is really good at recruiting wonderful students from everywhere. And a lot of those students, particularly undergraduates like Lainey, are willing to go back to where they came from to do work that involves talking with people, as well as pulling together all of the information that we might have. And so I have a student now who who will do some more work on unions. I've had people working on, I don't think I've had anybody who worked on public sector, but somebody tackled the whole question in a paper of why Scott Walker was able to, pass those anti-union measures, whereas that didn't happen in Ohio. And a lot of it came down to the fact that you have the recall in Ohio. So you could do a petition drive, which is in itself an organizing thing. It activates people. And as soon as the petitions are filed, the law goes into suspension. So the Ohio law that would have taken away the union dues and created an open shop had to be suspended, and then it was defeated. But the other difference was that I think in Wisconsin, they left the firefighters and the police out, and Governor Kasich made the mistake of and the Ohio Republicans made the mistake of including them. So it wasn't just women-heavy professions that were defending, it was the guys too. And so, it really comes down to that. Are there political handles that you can use to resist these things? And is the alliance broad enough to be able to carry all the friends, the families, you can get the kids off the couch to go vote.
Yeah. Oh.
Right. So I'm really interested in sort of the social networking that you talked about. Do you think that applies to public sector or service unions as well? Or
Absolutely. I think the SEIU, which is a union that has been building blue-collar clout and also kind of salaried people like nurses for quite some time. I think it has understood that you have to have these community and family components. The other thing that they've benefited from, of course, is that they've been able to to take advantage of the fact that attitudes in the labor movement toward immigration shifted. And that many of their members are immigrants. And so people can see them as co-workers, not as a threat. So it does get very specific. But if you're asking me, do social networks matter? Let me just tell you, they always matter. I study the rich in politics. It's not just checks, it's social networks. Professional unions, of course, depend on a sense of occupational status and pride, but they also depend on people contacting people they know and urging them to join a union, stick with it, look at issues a certain way. I'm having a hard time understanding how anybody ever forgot this. This has always been part of politics. Politics is who are we, who are they, and who's with us.
I have three quick questions. I won't keep too long. How did your work relate to Thomas Frank's 2004 work? What is the matter with Kansas?
Oh.
That's been a consistent theme in my mind. Why is there such a shift, especially in the Midwest? Number two, in your work being kind of about the Southern strategy that we used by the Republicans in the late 60s, early 70s, where they went for the racists in the South and say, look, these are the people we need to demonize. And then three, I know we talked about the shift of manufacturing types, going from steel, going from coal, moving to a new generation of material builds and manufacturing. Are we looking for new union opportunities now? Like you mentioned,
I hope so. I think the auto workers
now
are.
you have utilization within battery manufacturing and raw material. That new opportunities they can keep unions alive, even though the industry is shifting and changing.
To your third question, yeah, I think absolutely. I think that's unions have always known that that's the only way that they can stay alive. And I think that was why when the steel industry collapsed and mining is essentially gone, why those unions felt the need and to diversify what industries they represented. And even some of the interviewees that I talked to, spoke about that in the sense that understanding the need of the union to do that. But someone said, now anyone can be a steelworker, like a capital S steelworker. And so I think that people understood that without having made those efforts, the unions would have really, really suffered. And so I think the national or international level administrators know that they have to keep sort of on pace with what's coming next with, moving to battery plants. And we even saw, after the successful UAW strike that, they're going to start, organizing non-organized plans in Toyota and whatnot, hopefully. So I do think that they have to, and they will, try to keep on pace with what's changing.
I do think, though, that there's a lot more work that could be done, and I suspect people in this room will know a lot more than I do. I know the question, I don't know the answer, but I'm pretty sure that unions that have memberships in a technologically changing industry have hard choices to make. I mean, one is go out and recruit librarians instead of steelworkers, but what about trying to work with the regulated introduction and management of technological change? And I do think that's what the auto workers are trying to do with the electric car stuff. Now, that helps if you've got government on your side that can say something about what the source components and what the government, which is a big purchaser, for example, of vehicles, will buy. And the problem in our politics right now is that it's very hard for citizens to understand government activities that play out over a medium period of time. And our politics has been on the knife edge, and there's been things happen and then they get undone. Pretty much everything that President Biden has gotten through in the infrastructure bill is going to be undone. Of course, that's not the only thing that's going to be undone if Donald Trump wins the presidency, but it's one more thing. So I suspect some unions have done a better job of anticipating and handling technological change while maintaining membership and maintaining a voice. In my work, I study many different things historically, and those who are on top at time one often fail to adapt to time two. That's true of universities, it's true of governments, it's true of industries. It's often hard to understand that you've got a new challenge to meet when you think you're sitting pretty. And I'm pretty sure the steel industry thought, and steel workers thought they were sitting very pretty there for a while. You ask another question, about the polarization. Lainey's the one who's the expert on unions in the Rust Belt. I study all kinds of civic groups and social movements. And my previous research, well, God help me, my current research is about the rightward movement of the Republican Party. So I've studied that both from the top down and the bottom up. And this principle that the institutions where people meet outside of work and in their communities has been well understood by right-wing organizers for a long time. And when, after the civil rights movement of the 1960s, the two parties sorted themselves out, both Democrats and Republicans changed their stance, particularly on racial equality issues, or racial improvement issues at least. And then the Republican Party in the South and the Midwest moved to forming a much closer set of ties, mutually reinforcing ties, with the organized Christian right. And what's the basis of that? Well, the basis of that is people going to church and pastor networks that are willing to convey, at least indirectly convey, messages to people who go to church, sometimes on Wednesday as well as Sunday. It's not just, and in the case of the new mega churches that are now the scene of a lot of religious participation, there are lots of smaller groups that meet. And I just read an article. The Trump campaign is gearing up to hold conferences of pastors, take them to a nice place, have, I don't know, probably not Donald Trump himself, but some Trump, and General Flynn speak to them, and then hand them huge amounts of literature to hand out back in their congregations. By the way, there's nothing surprising about this. This is an understanding that there's very good research that shows that the reason that white Christian evangelicals have more political clout than their declining numbers would predict is that they're very faithful voters, and that they believe that a godly person votes for a Republican these days, a pro-life Republican in many cases. I think the same thing has happened with gun clubs. In my interviews with conservative grassroots people, sometimes get to the point where I could kind of put a little toe in the water and say, well, I understand everybody's hunting here. Fine for the elk, not so fine, but for the people, fine. But where I live, guns have a different meaning. Is it possible that there could be different solutions in different places? This is a very timid, I'm not an absolutist on this. And people will say yes, and then they'll snap to attention and remember that it's a slippery slope. And the minute anything is done to regulate any gun anywhere, they're coming for your constitutional rights. And the conversation is over at that. I mean, I just write down the answer in my interview thing at that point. But that's very typical, and that's because those messages are definitely being driven home again and again. The best research shows they're mixed in with social activities at all kinds of gun events. So I think the answer is yes, these processes have been playing out, and I studied the Koch network, and the Koch network is not just about checks, it's about getting rich people to interact with one another at these wonderful conferences they have in exclusive resorts twice a year, and then eventually the rich people started having their own little informal dinners so that they can reinforce one another's belief in what they need to do to save America. And everybody is connecting these things to a sense that they're saving America. As far as I can tell, everybody thinks America is, on all sides of the spectrum, thinks America is threatened, and everybody thinks the other people are the threat, and I hear the same phrases in my interviews from left and right. Yes, back there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Yeah, I heard a lot of sort of stories about that and how tight knit, communities were, and how people can remember their parents, and how much pride they had in those communities. And that's hard to maintain when industry goes. But I do think that there need to be ways that unions integrate into people's lives, into families' lives today in more sort of forceful and present ways. One of the things we talked about in the presentation about, changing family realities, might not be possible for the husband to go out to the bar right after work every night because he has to go pick up the kids, but you can still sort of potentially, make family events on weekends and try to get people involved with their families and that type of thing. And so I do think that there should be a prioritization of that type of activity because it does bring people together. So I agree with you.
Yeah, we're going to have to be creative because we're not going to go back to what us oldsters think are the good old days. But there still is a way to think, where are people celebrating things? Where are they socializing? Where children's sports remain a very important place where people come together. In my town of Cambridge, Massachusetts, even across class lines, because it's a multi-class city, which is kind of rare, but it is. And my husband and I, by the way, go to a diner at 6 a.m. every morning. And we have quite a community there, and not a single one of them is a Harvard professor. They are various kinds of working people. Big Mike with his huge rig parked right in front, taking up several parking spaces. And, an African-American lawyer who comes in and talks about her mother, and the Greek brothers who run the place, a couple of apartment managers. We get a lot of information about what's really going on, and of course the police officers come in and the firefighters come in, and I'm proud to say a couple of young police officers, a brother and sister, who are committing themselves to being good community policers in the tradition of Cambridge and not simply driving in from an outside area, which happens a lot in the police now. So that's just our little thing that we do, and we value that, and we deliberately do it so that we're interacting with people in a setting away from being professors. I think unions are doing some of this. I think the realization that it wasn't wise to disinvest all those resources and put them into lobbying has dawned on a fair number of union leaders, which is why we're not offering a lot of criticism. We think things are going on. And I happen to study the Democratic Party more, and I know that in certain key states like Wisconsin and Georgia, increasingly now in North Carolina, people are getting it, that Maine, where I spend my summers, is a very vibrant Democratic Party. And they simply make sure that they're holding social events, that they're cooperating with other groups to do things, that they're there all the time, not just at election time. And the indivisible movement and the resistance groups that swept the country, led mainly by older women who are not taken seriously by Democratic Party consultants, I can tell you that. They're wrong, the consultants are wrong, because those older women organized everywhere, all over. They often cooperate with unions, with civil rights groups, with immigrant groups, and they played a big role across the 67 Pennsylvania counties where we actually conducted a survey. We knew where the groups were and what they were doing. And so I think there are lots of different groups. We're not going to go back to a situation where everybody was neighbors with somebody in their workplace in most cases, but we can find ways to knit new ties and take into account that people are not just a paycheck.
Yep.
How big a moment, shall we say, do you think in all this happened when we had Stand Up for Steel and Gore didn't show up in the Bush campaign in West Virginia?
Well, I mean, I think that, so the main changes that we saw politically happened in the 90s to present. So it really happened after the Reagan era. But I think that starting in the 70s with, efforts to save industry that Democrats, didn't really support, didn't come out and try to make those efforts with the community. Efforts to even buy certain steel mills, a certain eminent domain, and create, employee-run steel plants and things of that nature in the 70s and 80s. I think that people felt that the National Democratic Party, could have made efforts to try to support workers during that era, and that they didn't. And similar to what we were saying before about how Obama helped in 2000, after 2008, with bailing out the auto industry and saving a lot of jobs in Michigan and Ohio. The same thing didn't happen back in the 70s and 80s when the steel industry was struggling, because there was this sense that there was an inevitability of the decline of manufacturing and a heavy industry in the U.S. and this move towards a service economy and a knowledge-based economy and all that, amongst both parties, Republican and Democrat. And so I think that, starting then and continuing on with Gore and in the 2000s, there was a sense that, the Democratic Party wasn't in these places and wasn't advocating for workers in the way that I think a lot of people felt that they should have been. So I don't know if it was, I wouldn't say it was all attributable to that particular moment, but that was one of many that started, and that people, have a right to feel that the Democratic Party didn't do enough during that period.
And part of the reason has to do with the way expertise functioned at that time. On the one hand, economists who, I'm not going to question people's motives. I think people honestly believe these were inevitable changes. And some people actually believe that the things that would emerge in the place of the industrial jobs that were lost would be better or adequate. And many political consultants were beginning to use high-tech data methods and not get a whole lot deeper than whether a particular word was used in an ad. I do think that there's been a backtracking from that, a realization a little late, after the horse is out of the barn, but better late than never, that there are other components that go into building a sense of political commitment and loyalty than just whether you have an economic policy that's automatically going to generate the answer that the Harvard Economics Department wants. The Harvard Economics Department has changed too, and now has economists that are studying what's happening to communities that different people grow up in. So, you know, I do think that each of those, that incident you mentioned is one of many, where even a symbolic stand would have at least communicated that people understood that this was not just the loss of some jobs or a short-term problem, that it was going to devastate entire ways of life. And it's been a little, inequality has been growing in America in more ways than one. It's been growing between the very rich and everybody else, and it's been growing between postgraduate educated people and everybody else, partly because we live in different places and don't notice each other's realities very easily.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to go back to the computer companies, steel workers, Eastern Ohio. And I can remember in '93 that the defunct steel workers, all of Marks Ferry, for the defunct Business Steel Corporation, we were watching, counting the votes for the ratification of NAFTA. We showed majority of Republican senators. There's a few Democrats. And in '94, a year after, victim fell in the ball of name. This reinforces what you said. Democrats abandoned unions.
Well, the unions, the Democrats all believed that there weren't enough union workers to make the difference anymore. And there were efforts, of course, to be fair, there were efforts to tweak labor law or reinforce labor law to make it easier to organize unions and not as easy to disorganize them legally. Those failed. And that's why it's very interesting to see the auto workers now trying to move into the South. Now, I think mainly with the German-owned plants, right? They're taking advantage of the fact that those people come from countries where unions are accepted. So they can do a workaround the right-to-work culture in the South. But we do know that historically, the fact that even at the height of the American labor movement, with the strength of the industrial unions, they couldn't organize very much in the South. That has huge feedback effects through the American political system, where for a long time the Democrats were divided between Northern Democrats who were tied to the unions and Southern Democrats who were tied to right to work and to racial exclusionary policies. So they just didn't have enough votes. They still don't have enough votes. I mean, there was an effort to do some of this, and you know, our friends Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, who won't be there much longer, but it'll be Jim Justice.
You mentioned the legal headwind. You may have 350 Starbucks locations that have unionized, but none of them got a first contract. They can fight that for years, and then, you know, talk to people, and it goes away. And what is it, Amazon, Starbucks, Elon Musk, they've all filed a lawsuit saying the NLRB is unconstitutional. Even the ACLU has joined in this little petty staff hiring they have to say that they had the NLRB.
What are they doing at the ACLU? I missed that one. What are they doing? What's the justification for that? Does anybody know? The ACLU, what are they doing?
Staff authority. Somebody just put out a law this week that they joined. They hired this someone Wallace, who I guess he's supposedly a management lawyer, and their position is that the general counsel, whoever the head of the NLRB is, I can fire the unconstitutional. They're saying it's not constitutional. Yeah, the fireman's law.
Well, with the federal courts as they are now, I can tell you that there's probably no limit to what the sentences are going to be. I mean, my son was a Supreme Court clerk for Justice Sotomayor, and of course he never talks about anything he's not supposed to talk about, but I follow the court very closely, and this is an ideological movement that's taken over the Supreme Court. And they really are not going to stop at much of anything. So we've got to find other ways, including state level law, which is more important for public sector, and perhaps can be adapted to help other categories of workers. The basic principle is when a roadblock exists in one place, you look for a way around it. Nobody gets to be a Harvard female tenured faculty member without that philosophy.
Kind of going off of that, we can talk about the political realignment parties. I mean, voters of the Democratic Party, but talk a little bit about the stance. I mean, I just personally think, you had a Republican Party that used to be, core tenets were immigration, free trade, because they're corporate interests, right? And now you have them coming, winning huge margins in the places that used to be critical of electing Democrats, Eastern Ohio, May 7th, when the counties on the lake and the counties on the river. Now the counties down the river are some of the most Republican strongholds because the party's coming in here and saying, hey, look what they did to you in NAFTA. We're not for this free trade. It's making a bunch of people rich. Meanwhile, you have the Democrats and their coalition looks more educated, more urban. Where's the political home given that that's the alignment now?
We are going through a period of profound party realignment. Now, that has happened again and again in American history. Our two major parties been with us since the Civil War, the two that we've got now, the labels. But what those labels mean has changed fundamentally. I think the reason that you see so many Republican-aligned politicians and elites at this point going MAGA, I mean, they really have. I mean, I don't think that there's a lot of dissent anymore. The reason is partly because they see real energy out there and new voters that can hold them into power and are articulating messages they think they want to hear. I have to say, I think NAFTA's over. I think that's nostalgia politics. I mean, you can talk about trade and technological change. I personally don't see any evidence that Republicans, when elected to office, are really going to correct these problems. That's putting it judiciously and in line with research findings. I'm not speaking as a citizen. If I were, that would not be very printable. But it's very clear that Donald Trump, and now it's more than Donald Trump, it's a lot more than Donald Trump, represents a sort of, I understand why you resent what's happened, politics. And I'm going to blow it all up for you and get at people that I tell you are the ones that are doing this to you. Certainly college professors, but also immigrants. And I don't know how many people out there at the grassroots really feel the level of hatred that is being spewed out in open political messages. But I do think that, when I did work with some of my students on the 2016 campaign, one of the things we did was to look where Donald Trump held his rallies. We did two things. We looked at the places he held his big rallies. As you know, they're huge rallies. Many people travel long distances to go to them. And they were very carefully cited. I don't think Donald himself does this, but somebody around him knew what they were doing. In these kind of, for example, the Mohegan Sun outside of Luzerne, outside of Wilkes-Barre in Luzerne County, but also in areas that were kind of declining economic areas or the exurbs. So when Trump went there, and he's quite a talented showman, he could say, I'm here. So that was it. And then the other thing we did was to look at what actual groups did he speak to. Usually he sits, he tweets and he goes to these big rallies, but he does occasionally speak before a group that would be meeting even if he weren't there. And so we tallied all those. I mean, Hillary Clinton was speaking to every group that would have her, so, the whole world, every convention. But Donald Trump only went to policemen's conventions, Fraternal Order of Police, border guards, gun, NRA and other gun conventions, and Christian pastors, especially the ones with the radio stations. So these were very carefully selected to be organizations that actually have ties to kind of local units and to issues that he could highlight, which he's continued to highlight. So this is a realignment. I don't think the Republican Party is going to be going back. The only thing I would say is the Republican Party is now very committed to the use of coercion and threats of coercion. And that is terrifying. The use of coercion and threats of coercion, or blinking at those who use those means. And that's terrifying because you can't really run a democracy with people not accepting the outcomes of elections and saying, well, I'll pick myself up and try again next time. And with people calling up local election workers and trying to harass them out of their jobs. Or when the fuss occurred at Harvard, I mean, I'm in the government department. We're guilty of a lot of things here. I won't go into it. But we had to close our offices because people were calling and threatening. And individual faculty or staff members at universities who are named are threatened. And we all know that the judges and the jurors and the public officials that are bringing these legal cases are being threatened. So that's a different thing, and that's really the end of democracy, small d. But if we're talking about the continuation of the competition between these catch-all parties, as we call them in political science, there is a realignment going on, and people with college degrees are moving increasingly, regardless of race or ethnic background, toward the Democrats, and people without them, who are more of them, are moving toward Republicans. And that, that whole party of Eisenhower or even Nixon, even John McCain seems kind of quaint at this point. And my own belief is that the people who opened the door to this on the Republican side were the Koch network. And they're not MAGA. They're not Trumpists. They don't like Trump. They think he's kind of, but they're happy to benefit from the energy he unleashes. And they hollowed out the Republican Party. They caused it to stop voting for road improvements or subsidies for businesses or getting along with unions where they were strong, which is Republicans used to do. They used to be sort of anti-union, but not fanatically anti-union. They came to terms in different places with whatever was good for business. And business meant companies that were actually employing people and producing things in the United States. That really is gone now. And once the Koch network persuaded Republican office holders and candidates that they should always cut taxes on the rich, always get rid of regulations, always attack unions, but not talk about immigration and race, because the Kochs don't really, that's not their thing. The people who became Tea Partiers and who have become Trump supporters said, that's not good enough for us. We don't like that. When my students and I studied the Koch network, we found that even the most committed grassroots conservatives on the Republican side didn't like it when they started talking about cutting Social Security and Medicare and veterans benefits. Well, they didn't like it because they were all on those programs, and they think real Americans have earned those programs. So we're now beyond Kochism. But if Donald Trump is reelected, he'll unleash the police force on the immigrants, and the liberals, and he will cut taxes for the Kochs. And Charles Koch will be very happy.